Nice to see everyone. We are on our third session of reading the narratives of the travels of the Jewish people between Egypt and Mount Sinai, corresponding to this time of year. And today is actually a very special day because it's Lag BaOmer, which is the middle point in those travels, the 33rd day of the Omer, and a day that's associated with the Hilula of Shimon Bar Yochai, with the death of Shimon Bar Yochai. So this is a day where there's supposed to be all the heavens open up for spiritual and mystical thinking and meditation, and a day when you get haircuts, because there's a tradition not to get haircuts during the Omer, and there's kind of like the ultra-Orthodox Woodstock happening at Mount Meron, where Shimon Bar Yochai is buried, and it's a little bit like a circus. They're having haircuts. Some people apparently sacrifice goats. It's a little wild. It gets a little wild. Music but a special day. And big bonfires. So this year they're laying off the bonfires because they're worried about fires. So we're going to start. We're going to, let's see, so just pull it up. Alan is not able to read this morning. So I told him he can have a double portion of reading next week. And we're going to begin reading chapter 16. Sorry, the end of 15, and then we'll be doing a lot of reading of sources today, I think. And I'm going to close my window because I can hear the landscaping people. There we go. All right. So Norma is going to read for us in the absence of, or Alan is here but unable to read.
Okay.
All right.
You want to go?
Yeah.
Okay, Norma, go ahead. So we're going to begin at verse 19.
I am very sorry, but you need to leave this room. You're getting too much trouble by yourself. That's the point.
The horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and riders went into the sea, and Adonai turned back on them the waters of the sea. But the Israelites marched on dry ground in the midst of the sea. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, picked up a hand drum, and all the women went out after her and danced with hand drums. And Miriam chanted for them, "Sing to Adonai, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea."
Okay, thanks. We'll stop there for a minute. Right, this is an important moment, right? We've all heard about this. Miriam and her timbrel and playing it, and getting to the mindset of the Israelites. What we've been talking about this whole time. This mindset of slavery, and they're arguing with God. Why did you take us here? And then God opening up everything for this big miracle and leading them across the sea, and all of the different aspects. What is this whole bit about Miriam leading them in song about? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
What is a hand drum? Is it a tambourine or?
Tambourine. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
David.
Go
ahead. Oh, okay. Excuse me. In the Hebrew, is Miriam called a prophet? Somehow I don't remember her being called a prophet.
Really interesting. So she is, and the commentators have a long discussion exactly about it, because they ask, well, was she a prophet like Moses, or was she a prophet? There are other people where Aaron's called a prophet. So is she a prophet like Aaron, or is she a prophet more like Moses? And but in our list, the Talmud, of course, which lists everything, Miriam is considered a full-blown prophet. She has the gift of prophecy, though we don't really hear her prophesize in the same way, but she has a status of prophet. So some of the commentators say it just means she was a good, powerful leader. It doesn't mean necessarily that she had a full gift of prophecy. But because of this moment here, her prophecy and the song that she leads, that the song that she led them in is considered to be a very high prophecy, right? Song can be prophecy. But let's quickly go to the sources. You may have heard this one before. Morris, do you mind reading the first Rashi?
Um,
Righteous women.
yeah, with timbrels and with dances, the righteous women in that generation were confident that God would perform miracles for them, and they accordingly had brought timbrels with them from Egypt.
So when Nancy, you're shaking your head. Can't hear you.
They were planning on celebrating at some point in the future. I mean, I understand people traveling with musical instruments, right? Especially small ones that are easy to carry, like a hand drum. But to just have it on hand, because that, I don't know. I'm having difficulty with that.
Because they believed in God, Nancy, and they believed that God would do that, would show them something.
But they didn't. That's everything that we've seen so far, Norma. We saw that they were reluctant to leave. We saw that they questioned Moses every single step of the way, that when they got to the edge of the sea, they were still reluctant to go in. So I can understand the celebration. I'm just questioning why Rashi would say, that's what I'm questioning, why Rashi would say, oh, they just happened to have them on hand to celebrate, just in case.
Well, I think there's a whole stream which talks about the faithfulness of the women, right? The men were the ones who were the ones who were struggling with faith, but the women, they had faith, right? There's a whole midrash. The back in Egypt, when Pharaoh made the decree that all the boys would be killed, the men said, well, let's stop having babies, you know. But what did the women do? The women started to wear mirrors and made themselves even more beautiful to entice the men, because they had faith that God would look after the babies no matter what happened. So, you know, I guess this tradition is saying that they both were alive and as slaves, right? Everything is complex. The slaves were both, you know, distrustful and didn't have faith and had to be taught faith. On the other hand, they had this tremendous faith at the same time. I mean, I love the complexity of it, right? Maybe both of it is true. You know, there are moments, I mean, look at all of us, right? There are moments we have tremendous faith, and there's moments where we lose our faith. There's no question about that, where faith is complex. And for them too, and both of those sides, the old slave side and even the side that kept on the faith for generations was alive. So both were real. And I guess it's a big question. You know, why bring timbrels with you when you pack light, right? Moses said, "Pack light." You know, pack light.
Yeah.
Because women are more hopeful in the long run anyway. And maybe that's why she just prayed that something good would happen. And she wanted to be prepared, you know, like the Boy Scout motto, be prepared.
Yeah, they didn't even bring enough to make bread. So they were just taking.
But they had timbrels.
Like what Nancy was saying, yeah, but they took their musical instruments.
Let's be positive.
You know, I once heard somebody talking about this, a colleague and friend, and he said that I was visiting him. I was giving a talk about the Jews of France. He had a synagogue in Rhode Island. He was a rabbi there, and so I visited a synagogue. And before my talk, he gave a little dvar, and he said this moment, it was in the middle of winter in Rhode Island. It was very, very cold. He says it would kind of be like going and buying sunscreen at the supermarket in the middle of winter. You know, hopeful, right? Okay, so let's move on. So this is the mindset that we're wrestling with, right? The two sides. They just crossed the sea, so they've experienced God's incredible downpour, and they've seen the greatest miracle performed in front of their eyes, before their eyes. And the question is, where are they, and what do they need to go through to get to Mount Sinai? And this is really what the whole next section is going to be about. it's all gonna come alive. Okay. Norma, please just read the next verse, the next one verse, because we're gonna really get deep into this. Go ahead. All of this.
Then Moses caused Israel to set out from the Sea of Reeds. They went on into the wilderness of Shur. They traveled 3 days in the wilderness and found no water.
So they're starting to travel again. We'll see, we'll get to the no water. But this is very unusual. Moses caused Israel to set out from the Sea of Reeds. What does that mean? Why did he cause? Go ahead, Nancy, or whoever.
It's not God. It's not God that is causing them to move out. It's Moses. And well, that was just all that I noticed, that it was Moses's decision. So Moses has taken the leadership role here away from Adonai.
How does the Hebrew translate that word cause?
Yeah, he made travel, which is interesting. It's the form of the verb, and it is interesting. You know, usually it would say usually it says, and Israel set out, right? There's nobody causing Israel. Israel set out. Moses made them do it, which, you know, makes Israel feel a little passive, right? In all this,
Like more forced.
So this is what Rashi says about this, and then we'll get to what Ibn Ezra says about it. But Moses caused or led Israel to journey. Morris, you might.
Yeah, he made them journey against their own will, because the Egyptians had adorned their horses with ornaments of gold and silver and with precious stones, and the Israelites were finding these in the sea. Greater, indeed, was the booty they obtained at the Red Sea than the booty they had brought out of Egypt. As it is said, circlets of gold, the booty of the sea, will we make thee together with the studs of silver, which we brought forth from Egypt. On this account, he was compelled to make them journey on against their will.
So what is that saying about where
They wanted to stay and collect more stuff, and he said, no, we got to get going.
Yeah.
But it's also, I'm sorry, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
What it also explains why a people on the move that had been formerly enslaved happened to have booty in the middle of the desert in order from which to construct a golden calf. I mean, I've never understood how people on the move who are escaping slavery just happen to have enough gold and silver on their persons, right? I mean, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough water, but they got gold and silver in the middle of the desert. I mean, it's akin to having a timbrel after the crossing. I can believe that one a whole lot more, but this actually explains where the precious metals to build the golden calf came from.
They took it also when they were leaving Egypt. They took gold and silver from their neighbors. And here it's kind of repeated, except with the difference is in Egypt, when they take the gold and the silver, the Torah itself says that the Egyptians gave it to them. God inclined the hearts of the Egyptians. When they were leaving, the Egyptians were like, just get out of here, get out of here, take our gold, take our silver, just leave. We don't want to see you anymore, right? And here they're kind of going. So what does it say about the Israelites that they're trying to stick back and kind of pull gold out of the sea? Does that make you judge them unfavorably?
They look greedy. But I think greedy is the wrong word. I mean, they look like gleaners is what they look like here.
Well, they're going to be traveling, they don't know where, and there's suddenly they don't have many possessions, saying there's gold and silver coming on the sea, and it's that part of them that wants to assure their own future, right? When you're a slave or if you're and generally don't have in the down and out, you want to always thinking about, the right depression era people, they say, right there, right after that, they still, I know a lot of people who grew up in the Depression, and they still afterwards are always trying to collect as much stuff and keep in their pantry, and there's a whole kind of mindset that comes from that, and So, but Moses, what is Moses saying? Moses is saying, no, we got to move on. It's the opposite of what he's trying to teach them, maybe. He wants them to teach them to rely on God. Okay. So now go ahead. Nancy, go ahead.
All right.
I don't think they're saying anything.
Norma, you're about to say something. No? Okay.
Ibn
Go ahead.
Ezra.
Ibn Ezra has something interesting.
Okay, and Moses led, I believe that the pillar of cloud and likewise the pillar of fire that went before the people when they left Egypt was to ensure that Israel was able to go by day and night. After Pharaoh and his hosts drowned, Israel was no longer frightened. It did not travel at night. Indeed, we do not find it recorded in the Torah portion, V'halaktecha, in which we find a description of Israel's journey, that Israel journeyed at night. Behold, Moses now led the people according to God's command. There are only 6 journeys from the Red Sea until Mount Sinai, lasting less than 40 days. Israel journeyed from the Red Sea on the 21st of Nisan until the 1st of Sivan, when they came to the desert of Sinai. The air is then good. It is neither humid nor cold. He does not have a tent. He who does not have a tent can live outdoors without harm. When Israel came to the wilderness of Sinai, they all erected booths as they camped there for about a year. Moses informed them that they would tarry there until they consecrated the tabernacle. It was for this reason that as I will explain, Israel brought out acacia wood from Egypt.
But so interesting. But what the commentators go, I love when they bring all this stuff. So even Ezra, who lived in Spain, but I think had a good sense of the climate and the desert, says, well, this time of year, the climate is good in the desert. But what he's saying is that he's trying to describe what was the feeling of their travels, right? So here he's saying they stopped being fearful, right? Once they crossed the Red Sea, they went into a whole other state of mind. They stopped being fearful. They started, and they were just camping out because the temperature is not too hot, not too cold, right? It's springtime. I'm not sure Ibn Ezra was actually ever in Sinai, because I think this is a very hot time of year in Sinai. But maybe in Spain, this is a good time of year. They just could camp outside, and they didn't need to travel at night. There was no pillar at night anymore. So it's a new period for them, right? They're starting to enjoy a certain element of freedom, a certain element of even though they're traveling and there's no water, which we're about to get to, something is shifting for them, right? There's also, if it's almost like the feeling they left Egypt with haste, right? That we know, right? They left with haste. There was a fire guiding them at night. They went, really fast. But now the Egyptians are gone, right? The Egyptians are nowhere to be seen. They've drowned in the sea. They're holding the gold of the Egyptians, and now they're just in this different space. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine, but they're just traveling free within the desert and just starting to let go of what came before. It's a different kind of state of mind. A freedom to it. Now I wanted to do a little, because I sometimes you read the commentators, you get pulled into a tangent. So he's talking about that they started to build the sukkahs, right? Why do we observe Sukkot? Because they built sukkahs when they arrived in Egypt, right? It commemorates this time of year. Anyway, Ibn Ezra has this whole thing about acacia wood. I just brought it because I thought it was really interesting. So this is now we're talking about the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that's made out of ram skins, dolphin skins, and acacia wood. So the question is, where did they get the acacia wood from? So Norma, do you mind just continuing now?
Ibn Ezra on Exodus 25:5, tanned ram skins, dolphin skins, and acacia wood. Now we do not know whether our ancestors had a tradition that the Israelites took the acacia wood out of Egypt. If they did, then we will accept their tradition. However, if their statement is based on reasoning, then we must seek another explanation. We suggest that there was a forest of acacia trees next to Mount Sinai. When Israel came to Sinai, Moses told them that they would be spending a long time there. I have already explained that there was no cloud over them at this time. Each one of them then made a booth. The princes made court-like structures, each one in accordance with his status. They cut the entire forest down, for they were a large nation. They made booths.
So it's what interesting stuff, right? So why did I? One of the reasons I brought it is because he's also, first of all, he's addressing a question, which is where did they find all the acacia wood that they needed to make both the tabernacle, but also all the sukkahs? You know, and could you really leave Egypt with that much acacia wood, you know, with you? We talk about timbrels. Where did that acacia wood come from? You know, so he's saying the acacia wood must have come from a forest, and there's no reports of any acacia wood forest near Mount anywhere in the Sinai desert. So he thinks it must have been cut down. So really interesting stuff. But why I brought it here is because it also gives you a sense that they're starting to build a society, right? They're starting to build, and the princes are building large sukkahs, and other people are bringing short sukkahs, and it's, you know, they're starting to build their nation. They're starting to build who they are. They're starting to create a new beginning. And there's different parts to it. But as they're building a new beginning, there's also the crisis of they're traveling through the desert and they found no water, right? And you can't travel for very long without water, as we know. Someone else, would you mind starting to read for us? They came to Marah.
But wait, they don't say anything about where they got the dolphin skins or the tanned ram skins, or do they bring those with also?
No, maybe there's a lot of
Dead
interesting
animals?
about the dolphins. You know what? And it's an animal that they're not sure. Was it a dolphin? Rashi says it was a multicolored unicorn, but
That's funny.
an animal that no longer exists.
Yeah, mythical.
Go ahead.
I'm looking at a satellite picture in Google Earth of
Uh-huh.
Mount Sinai right now, and these mountains are green, which implies trees.
Interesting.
Yes,
I've
it's
been,
desert, but the mountain tops are green, and there are trees there.
you know, I've been somewhat to Sinai in the rainy season. The least part of Sinai that I was in did not have, of the Sinai desert, did not have anything resembling a forest. I mean, they had somewhat date trees, and there were some trees scattered here and there. But I'm no expert on it, but it could be, you know, it is.
There's some kind of vegetation.
We often call it a desert, but the word in Hebrew, midbar, is really wilderness, and wilderness is less of a stark than the desert. It's not these are not sand dunes. This is just wilderness. And I think it's a more correct translation than desert. But I think you're right. It could be. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. May I ask a question about Ibn Ezra's method, or is that too remote to what we're doing? Because you brought in this fascinating passage, and at the beginning of it, I don't have it in front of me, but in the beginning of the passage, he says, or part of it, he says, if our ancestors had the tradition that they brought the acacia wood from Egypt, okay, they went to Home Depot and they got the acacia wood and they left Egypt. I'm cool with that because that's our tradition. So there might be other traditions other than our written text, and he can accept that. But if they don't have that tradition, and I don't know how he determines that, but if they don't have that tradition, he says, then, and if they did this on the basis of at least what the translation calls reasoning, then it sounds like he's saying they're, and correct me if this is just wrong, that they're that they're thinking abstractly based on possibilities that exist, and you could draw inferences. And in that case, he feels free to draw his own and to suppose things to be the case, like the forest in the Sinai, which I find so very interesting. It's like it's sort of like having a midrash and having the freedom to create one, but he's not doing it on the basis of a particular textual peculiarity. He's saying, let me just think about what's possible in the world, and wouldn't that be a thing? And I wondered if that's something he does.
It is. And I go ahead. You want to say something?
That's all. No, that was just my question.
No, partly in this class, what I'm enjoying is we're getting to know the different voices of the different commentators, right? Rashi, he brings the voice of the received tradition. He brings, the traditions and the midrash that came before him. He compiles what came before, and he can be quite fantastical. He's happy to, even though Ibn Ezra has a really distinct voice. Ibn Ezra, he's also early, right? Not that much later than Rashi, and Ibn Ezra has two commentaries, one short and one long. Why does he have one short and one long? Because you would get more money. It basically allowed him to sell his commentary twice. So he was able to sell his commentary. That's how he made money. He was like a roving, rabbi, and so he made money so he sold his commentary twice. One the long version, one the short version. He was able to do that. And so in this long version, he does do this. And Ibn Ezra is often thought of as he's very logical. Conservative rabbis like to claim him as a kind of early, rational thinker who's willing to look within historical context. And I didn't bring the earlier part of his whole comment, where he kind of talks about the received tradition that they brought acacia wood from Egypt. And he kind of says, this is a little ridiculous. How could they have brought all that acacia wood from Egypt? Where did they get it? And he breaks it down in certain ways. Logically, he says, first of all, you're leaving in haste. Where did you get the acacia wood leaving on the night of the Exodus? Where did you get that from? And so he says, logically, it doesn't make sense. And he says, the Torah mentions they got the jewelry, but are you really going to your neighbors and asking them for acacia wood? Doesn't make sense either. So he's really trying to examine it logically. And then he's kind of building, and as you said, if he's saying, if that comes from a tradition, as in a tradition that goes back, word of mouth, thousands of years, all the way to those who left Egypt, then I'll accept that tradition because he doesn't want to be seen as going against a legitimate tradition. But if earlier traditions are just, creating it out of thin air, which is a little dig at some midrash, a little dig at maybe Rashi even, then I'm gonna give another explanation which seems more logical to me, which was there was a forest around Mount Sinai and they cut down the trees and they used that wood to build the tabernacle, which is more logical.
That makes more sense, I would think.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see, they're trying to see what makes sense from they're willing to accept miracles, but then there's some things that are like, well, God made the acacia wood appear. We don't see any mention of that. So where did it come from? And it's an interesting kind of way of looking at the text. We are also building connection between different parts because where do they find the wood for the sukkahs, right? That's one question, for all those people, and where do they find the wood for the tabernacle? And we're going to see more of Ibn Ezra because Ibn Ezra's, this is a role he takes on quite in his long commentary, which is the one I'm going with. He had to justify selling his longer commentary, so he went on a little bit longer but he comes up with some really interesting stuff. Okay. Who was reading the came to Marah?
Norma.
They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. That's why it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to Adonai, and Adonai showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There Adonai made for them a fixed rule. There they were put to the test. God said, "If you will heed your God diligently, doing what is upright in God's sight, giving ear to God's commandments, and keeping all God's laws, then I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I, Adonai, am your healer.
Okay.
Why does he say God sometimes? Why does it say God sometimes and sometimes the Hebrew for it?
Because well, the yud the yud he vav he is never translated, but in the Hebrew it says yud he vav he, and then it says Elohecha, which is your God. So it's saying, so it's its way of translating it.
Okay.
So we come to this interesting episode, right? There's no water, and they grumble against God, and they find a way of making the water sweet. But then God really uses this as a kind of educational moment for them. It's a very interesting. It's almost no other moment where it's as deliberate how he's bringing the educational moment. Again, this is the first time they grumble, and it's one of the first. It's the first thing that happens to them really after they leave the Red Sea, right? After they're traveling. So what do you think? Are you critical of them for their grumbling against Moses?
Kind of they're blaming him. He took them there and then they're thirsty. So people just naturally rebel against the leader.
Well, this is a traumatized group here. They've just been through a lot, to say the least. And they have no home. They have no home. And they don't know what the future holds. And they're in the middle of an unpopulated wilderness. And they've come from a place where they had lodging, they had food, they had predictability, and now all of that is cast to the wind. I mean, they really are starting over from square one, right? I mean, it's almost like they're, in a sense, they're beginning again, right? Except for that they're not in Eden now, they're in the wilderness now. And Eden is paradise, but this is reality. Okay. So yeah, I can see why they would be doubting Moses and doubting themselves and doubting Adonai and reaching into the depths of their own souls individually and collectively to figure a way forward.
Interesting. Well, and you know, the Red Sea is often described as, right, a birth, right? They went through the waters, and then they're born. So they're born, and you can imagine you experience an incredible miracle. You're in the heights, the prophecy you experience, your mind has been open, you're high with being free, you're traveling, the air isn't too cold and they're too hot. But a few days in, you're like, well, I'm a little thirsty here. What's going to happen? But you know, the question is, where are they? Could they have? What happened? So here's Or Chaim, a Moroccan commentator. He's much later. He's 16th century. Morris, do you mind reading?
Yeah. Let's see.
Or Chaim. Yeah.
Okay. The people murmured against Moses, etc. The Torah criticizes the manner in which the people provoked a quarrel. The Torah does not deny the validity of the people asking for drinkable water, i.e. the question, what are we to drink? They should have asked for their needs in an appropriate manner.
It's like I tell my kids, you know, say, please, what's the magic word?
Please.
Right, yeah.
Well, Rabbi, isn't this where Miriam comes in?
The Miriam and the whale.
Yeah, in terms of water.
No, it's actually at a different point where Miriam's well comes up, but it is Miriam later becomes associated with the well.
Oh.
But here, So it's interesting, right? We have this whole thing where, so God shows him a piece of wood, but there's a lot of this moment and the moment of the striking of the rock, right? Because here there's also water that's needed, but here there's a way that's made, the water is made sweet. Beautiful symbolism, right? God makes the water sweet. Then God made for them a fixed rule, so they were put to the test. So what's the test?
God said, if you will heed your God diligently, doing what is upright in God's sight, giving ear to God's commandments and keeping all God's laws, then I will not bring you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, right? I am your healer. So
Have the laws arrived yet?
Yeah.
It seems to me there aren't any commandments at this particular point. There might have been traditional commandments, but nothing formal. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, because Mount Sinai has not happened yet. So this is why we have a tradition, which we'll read from Rashi. Maury, do you mind reading the next one?
Here we made for them a statute and an ordinance. At Marah, he gave them a few sections of the Torah in order that they might engage in the study thereof.
Hi, Norma. It's Sex calling. Hi, Ed. I'm fine. How are you?
The sections containing the command regarding the Sabbath. The red heifer and the administration of justice.
So,
So according to Midrash, he was given, right? God gave the people here a little bit of laws. Why would he give the laws to people here at this moment of, they've complained and he's made the situation better? Well, let's read the next bit, which elucidates it, but also we can talk about it. It's a question why he's given them law. According to Midrash, he gave them Shabbat. This is when they get Shabbat, which is interesting. But go ahead.
So, Sforno, to find out if they will be willing to accept statutes, the laws not given to our intelligence to understand, as well as social legislation, and they would not ignore it when they were not in a state of crisis, as now when they needed water through a miracle.
And then, so this means, and if you hear the sound of my voice, go ahead.
And to accept the statutes which would follow as a way of life, not merely as emergency regulation in the desert. And if from now on, they would carefully observe God's commandments, endeavoring to live according to their understanding of what is pleasing to him, then they would be permanently spared any of the afflictions that God brought upon the Egyptians. The implication was that betraying God's trust would have painful consequences. The entire experience is a reminder of the manner in which rabbis relate to a potential convert to Judaism. One does not present Judaism in rosy, attractive colors so as to encourage him to convert, but on the contrary, one appraises him first and foremost of the yoke of the commandments, telling him of all the things he would have to forego by joining the Jewish people, the Jewish religion. Moreover, one advises him that whereas up until now he was able to eat certain foods, such as chalev, not only would he no longer be able to eat these foods, but violation of the commandment would carry the penalty of karet, the loss of entitlement to his afterlife, etc. Only after he has duly absorbed this information does he proceed with teaching him the intricacies of Judaism. What happened at Marah was preparatory to accepting Judaism at Mount Sinai. If the people had not gone through this process, it is doubtful that they would have said, "We will do, now let us learn God's Torah," when the time came for this a few weeks later. So, yeah, so I didn't remember this or know this, that at Mara, they were given this initial taste of the laws.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the words, if you will heed your God diligently, this sounds like the book of Deuteronomy, right? This sounds like the Shema a little bit, right? This sounds, but what do you make of this whole thing about God will heal you, God will keep you? Is this just like the Shema kind of thing? Or, oh, the rains will come at the proper time, the second paragraph of the Shema? I mean, it's not. Is God going to heal them of all diseases? I mean, what is it saying? And why does God make this the linchpin of their, why is God teaching them with healing?
Well, why is God giving them any commandments? Why are commandments such a central piece here, and following the commandments? What does that mean, that the God needs people to follow the commandments? Is this a social structural thing in order to create a people with laws, etc., or is this something else? It's hard to know what the status of the commandments are.
A big question, and what is the purpose of the commandments? A big philosophical debate. The later Orthodox thinkers say there's no purpose, that the one should be asking, just do them. But earlier, well, Maimonides says every commandment has a purpose, has a reason for it, and to build a people of holiness, or my personal view. But it is an interesting thing. Here they are, they complained, God made it better, but then God gave them commandments right afterwards. It's kind of like, Mike, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but my kids asking me for a sweet, and finally I say, okay, I'll give you a sweet, but I haven't given them a sweet. I say, but let me give you a few rules from now on. This is how it's going to be. If you listen better to me, then now you're gonna you'll be able to have a sweet once a day, and you'll get your allowance once a month, but only if you clear your table and do what you need to do to be a good 6-year-old. Norma, you're on mute. Still on mute.
I said, like, you're letting the kids know the rules, and maybe that's what God was doing also, letting them know the rules.
I'm here for you, but you also have to you have a part to play in all of this.
Well, is this kind of like a gotcha moment? Like you need water, but in order for you to get water,
Better.
you have to do these things that I want you to do?
It seems very transactional here, right? I mean, you need water, I need you to follow my commandments. And I think David makes a really good point about why are they commandments at this point, right? Well, maybe because the people don't have faith yet, or they haven't developed their faith, or they're in the process of developing a relationship with the divine. I'm not sure.
Do you know what it might be too, is the people were slaves before, so they didn't need commandments, they just needed a whip. Okay, there were physical things that drove them here and there. A commandment is some sort of an intellectual structure. And maybe with the Jewish people, God's going to try an experiment. He's going to create intellectual structure that is going to control these people, or not control, is going to give structure to these people, which is probably a good thing. And you have to start it somewhere. So you start it with I'm going to do a miracle for you. And then the intellectual structure comes, but it's not a whip structure. It's an intellectual structure, which is very, very different than what they were used to.
And very nice. And there's a carrot at the end, which is God will heal you, right? It's not only that God, you'll do it, but also if we think about it, God just freed you, you're going into the desert, you might think that now it's going to be one big party, you're going to be free, you're going to enjoy yourself, it's going to be a great life. And if God suddenly said, wait a second, it's not such a big party, I'm going to give you commandments, they might try away say, well, we're not sure we want your commandments. But here, they know they need God, and God did a miracle for them. It's a good place to introduce a few laws to let them know it's, I didn't free you to just go and do whatever you want, but as David was saying, is an experiment, which I wrote this in my essay to get into rabbinical school. I said, what was all this about? It was about trying to take a primitive people and make them jump many steps forward, in their spiritual and moral and ethical life. And it's not easy to do so. So you have to have a very rigid structure because people, it's hard for people to grow. And sometimes you need a very rigid structure. This is military school, right? This is going to send you to military school. So this is a rigid intellectual structure but also a physical structure, a spiritual structure they'll be receiving. But the goal, of course, is that, first of all, there's a carrot, which is God is going to be with you in the desert in a way he's with nobody else while you're going through your initial training. But also you're going to have, you're going to be a holy people, and you're going to bring holiness into the world, which eventually becomes a good carrot too. So let's go to this healing business also, because the question is, what does it mean that God's going to heal you? Unless somebody else wanted to continue the conversation about this. Okay, Morris, please read Rashbam. Rashbam is the grandson of Rashi, who likes to contradict his grandfather a lot in his commentary.
Right.
Also a French rabbi. Okay, go ahead.
There at Mara, as a result of the complaints and the resolution of the crisis, God taught the people that it would pay them to accept God's laws, as failure to do so would result in God withdrawing his vital support from them. They were to learn that God was not only willing, but also able to provide all their needs. This is why the experience is referred to as, was it nosol? A trial. God himself spelled out the lesson after having supplied them with water to see if they would listen to his instructions and carry out his ordinances. He added the assurance that if people would take the lesson to heart, all the diseases which we had brought upon Egypt, commencing with turning the source of life, the waters of the Nile, into blood, would not afflict the Israelites with. We know from Exodus that blessing one's food and water is equivalent to keeping away diseases from people.
So the question here is, first of all, there's a link here that the commentators are picking up, right? The first plague was the Nile turning to blood. And here, this first miracle is the waters turning sweet, right? There's a connection there. It's kind of like the opposite of that plague. But also saying, what exactly is this healing that they're talking about? Go ahead, Chizkuni, another French rabbi.
For I, the Lord, am your physician. I would have to act as your physician after you had decided to listen to my voice, having been afflicted with such diseases as I struck the Egyptians with. If understand our author correctly, he means that these diseases would not be considered as natural as Israelites had learned while in Egypt, that they were means of God punishing people as opposed to diseases that had not.
Iatrogenic diseases, actually. in some strange way. These are not natural diseases. These are diseases caused by the doctor.
I mean, so this is the big question, right? The question is what is he saying he's going to heal them of? Which I think is a very interesting question. Is he saying you're not going to be sick at all when you're in the desert? Or is he saying you're not going to have any of the diseases that the Egyptians had? Or is he saying, I'm not going to, all the plagues you saw, and now we're able, and I was good. You saw all the plagues it did to the Egyptians. If you're good, I am not going to give you those boils. I'm not going to give you those things. So what is God promising them? And I think that the larger question that there's this big disagreement between many different commentators, I'm only bringing a few, is, God, everybody gets sick, right? So the question is, even the pious, most righteous people get sick. God is the most pious, righteous people. Some of them live to 99 or 120, and some of them live to 50. So what does it mean that God is your healer? And I think that's the underlying question.
It sounds like God is introducing something called fear into the equation. And this is a fear not of a physical attack, not of somebody hurting you with a whip. This is a much higher level fear. This is a fear, an intellectual fear, that if you don't do these things properly, then you will be punished by the causing of disease. Now, unfortunately, because this particular notion is open to all kinds of fanciful forms, people can drive themselves crazy with this and end up following these commandments unbelievably excessively. And in fact, I think that's what Rabbinic Judaism did. Rabbinic Judaism built fences and fences and fences around the Torah just to make sure that the fear aspect could be put into control.
Mm-hmm. And because the rabbis themselves wanted to control Jews too, but probably. But I agree. I definitely agree. There's a sense of the fear, and we see this even to this day in some ultra-Orthodox people, that they're worried, you don't do one thing. If you're sick, check your mezuzahs. That's what people will say, right? Check your mezuzahs. Because maybe your mezuzahs are not...
You're tilted wrong, yeah.
They're tilted, or the scroll's not right. I mean, there's something, this is where it's not, I don't think there's a black and white line. And I think there's the way the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, says it, which I think is the nicest way of saying this. He says, well, what does it mean, all this stuff? It means when you're in alignment with God and the universe, when you're in tune with God and the universe, when you're praying and feeling in tune with the world around you, even when you're sick, you take it in stride, you're able to, but when you're not in tune with the universe, the tiniest thing that comes to you, it upsets you, it drives you crazy, everything worries you, it gets you in trouble, but when you're in tune with the universe, if the rains don't come, you say, it causes you hardship, but you understand this is part of the rhythms of our physical world. But when you're not in tune with the world, so in some ways there is something when you're feeling out of tune, when you're feeling not well within yourself, maybe there is something spiritual you do to yourself to help put yourself back in tune. There's something you can do that will, you can follow a mitzvah, go help another person. If you're feeling within yourself that you're not at peace with yourself, saying a bracha can help, saying those things can help. And I think, that's the nicest way of looking at all of that, right? That there are discipline. Judaism and all the mitzvot are they're a commandment, but they're also a discipline that helps put you in tune with a spiritual life, right? Every element of life is doing something for you. But it can become, the magical thinking aspect, which may have some truth, but it can certainly drive you completely crazy if you're thinking people will say this in the Orthodox world, is something, my son, somebody had a disease, so it must be because you weren't following the commandments properly, and
how do you explain, like Rabbi Kushner's book, when bad things happen to good people? I mean, his little child certainly hadn't done anything to
Yeah.
not follow God's precepts. And Rabbi Kushner, as I know him, has certainly not done anything either.
Yeah, he's a good man. Well, some Orthodox people will say, well, maybe it's because of some other family person. But this is a very hard conversation, the Talmud. And Talmud says, if something bad happens to you, what's the first thing you do? You ask yourself, is there anything I'm doing and I'm not doing properly? You know, that's the first question you ask. And if you examine yourself and you say, no, I'm acting nicely, I'm doing properly, and then you check your mezuzahs and make sure that they're all. Then the third option, and this is a very hard one, and I don't think we need to get into this long conversation, but he said, then the Talmud says it's isurim shel ahava, it's sufferings of love. God sometimes sufferings out of, so to speak, love, to force us to grow and learn things. And I don't want to get into that whole thing, but that's a hard one, and then that's why people like Kushner will, they don't want to go there. So they just say, well, God doesn't have the ability to do these things. I tend to pick an alternative road, which is much more complex, but I can't take away God's ability to intervene in the world. For me, that's not enough God. I need God to be able to intervene. So for me personally, what I'll say is, we can't understand everything, and that I accept a little bit of Kushner's, which is, God's intervention in the world is very limited for supernatural reasons because of the laws that were established and free will and all these things. But that's a very big conversation we can have. That's not in the class. But I wanted to bring another view on this whole healing business, which is the Or HaChaim. And he says the Torah here refers to diseases which are not due to divine intervention, such as a common cold contracted due to one's carelessness. God undertakes to protect us even against such diseases which are not normally controlled by him if we live according to his precepts. So he's doubling down, right? Or HaChaim is doubling down on this concept, which is, if you're really living a godly life. Another way for me to understand this is, right, in Chinese medicine or even Indian, if you're in the yogic system and other Eastern, if you're truly, they believe if you're truly following a godly life, all diseases also has a spiritual root to it, and again, a long conversation, but interesting to see our commentators trying to come to grips. What does it mean that God is our healer? Which is one of the biggest questions out there. So we'll continue the journeys next week.